This is VOA Africa.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gitu-Ewart. It's Wednesday, January 15th. This is Africa 54. Nigeria pays tribute to soldiers killed in the fight against Boko Haram terrorist group. A plague of locusts is wreaking havoc in Kenya and threatening its food security. And finding practical ways to encourage young girls and women to get into technology. We'll have a live report. We'll have those stories shortly. But we begin in East Africa, where Sudan has reopened its airspace on Wednesday after repelling an armed revolt by former security agents linked to ousted former President Omar al-Bashir, according to the head of the Sovereign Council that now runs the country. The army says the 2 soldiers were killed and 4 were wounded in several hours of fighting in Khartoum against former members of the once feared security service before government forces stopped the uprising late Tuesday. The military also seized 2 small oil fields in Darfur that had been taken by insurgents. Former employees of the National Intelligence and Security Service who had been protesting against their severance packages shut down the 2 oil fields on Tuesday. The violence was the biggest confrontation so far between the old guard and supporters of the new administration. The United Nations Refugee Agency is appealing for $447 million to provide essential aid for more than 900,000 refugees in Sudan and for the nearly 250,000 Sudanese hosting them. The agency is teaming up with more than 30 other partners to provide the refugees with shelter, health, education, and other crucial aid for survival. The vast majority of refugees are from South Sudan, but the agency says resources are also needed for refugees from 9 other countries who have fled violence and persecution. Meanwhile, UNHCR spokesman Baba Baloch says Sudan continues to receive new refugees, putting more pressure on its diminishing resources. Baloch tells VOA refugees in Sudan are scattered over 130 locations across the country's 18 states, some in very remote areas. Nigerian authorities have been battling the Boko Haram terrorist group for a decade in a conflict that has cost the lives of an estimated 35,000 people. In a recent ceremony, Nigeria marked Armed Forces Day by remembering the soldiers killed in the fight against the insurgency. Timothy Obiezu has the details.
The special remembrance event for troops took place in the Nigerian capital and in states like Borno, Adamawa, and Yola, the epicenters of Nigeria's decade-long war against the Boko Haram insurgency. About 200 widows and relatives of slain officers received food and financial support at this Abuja venue. Olubumi Adetunji's husband, a soldier, was killed by Boko Haram during fighting in Maiduguri in April 2016, leaving her behind with their 4 children.
I thank the defense headquarters and the army headquarters for what they have been doing in my life, because since then, 2016, I don't know how much they sell rice in the market. They provide rice, provision, and they give even the school, the children, sponsorship. They call us every year to pay the sponsorship.
The tribute to Our Heroes concert marks the first edition of an annual concert project by the Defense Ministry to honor fallen troops. Top Nigerian entertainment stars, musicians, and comedians all performed at the event. Larry Osonyin Tolu is a personnel official at the Defense Ministry.
The aim of this project is to let you know that the future of defense staff, armed forces of Nigeria, and indeed the nation at large have not forgotten you, and that you are never alone, as you are always in our prayers.
Nigerian authorities are battling a decade-long insurgency by the Islamist militant group Boko Haram. An estimated 35,000 lives have been lost, including military officers at the front lines of the battle. Security expert Kabiru Adamu head of Abuja-based Beacon Security Consulting, says events like the concert are good for boosting morale and inspiring confidence.
The insurgency has been waging for about 10 years now, so I think this is a very good development. There are issues regarding the relationship between the military and the public in the locations where they are fighting. So this type of morale boosting activity, like the concert, I think it's a very good development.
As the military continues to battle Boko Haram, millions affected by the fight who are living in camps are hoping to return home. Meanwhile, families of fallen soldiers remember their loved ones and hope the killing will soon come to an end. Timothy Obiezu for VOA News, Abuja.
Parts of Africa are under attack by crop-wreaking locusts. The insects ravaged Somalia and Ethiopia before recently migrating to Kenya. He is VOA's Arash Arabasadi.
A biblical plague of free-roaming locusts poses an existential threat to crops in parts of East Africa. Kenyan Agriculture Minister Mwangi Kianjuri.
The first swarm crossed the border into Kenya from Somalia on 28 December 2019. Other swarms continued coming in from Ethiopia.
These desert locusts are part of the grasshopper family. They pose such a danger to crops that the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, calls the invasion the Horn of Africa's worst situation in 25 years.
We recognize that the pest invasion and potential to spread rapidly to other counties pose unprecedented threat to food security and livelihoods in the country.
Out of desperation, local authorities tried everything from spraying tear gas to shooting the insect out of the sky. Now, Kianjuri says the government loaded pesticides aboard aircraft to spray swarm areas, but there is still much to do.
Fighting this invasion is not without challenges. First, there are transboundary pests that must be fought through a regional strategy. Unfortunately, because of insecurity in some of our neighboring countries, it has been difficult to fight and prevent their migration.
The FAO calls the risk low for locust breeding in Kenya. They found some 70,000 hectares of neighboring land infested in December. Swarms can travel 130 kilometers per day, be a kilometer wide, and contain as many as 80 million locusts. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News, Washington.
China is using its economic and diplomatic leverage to silence critics abroad and undermine international human rights systems, according to the 2020 Human Rights Watch World Report. The report claims that Beijing's effort not only suppresses the rights of its own citizens, but extends far beyond its borders. VOA's Jesusamin Ani has more.
After an English Premier League player posted messages online criticizing China's policy towards its minority Uyghur Muslims, Beijing canceled the broadcast of his team's match, a warning shot from the league's most lucrative market. It's just one of the ways China is using its economic influence to suppress free speech worldwide, according to a Human Rights Watch report.
China has been harassing and intimidating any kind of activities and speeches that criticize China's human rights record in the UN. Around the world in different countries, China has been censoring speech that criticize the Chinese government, using its economic and diplomatic leverage.
According to the Human Rights Watch 2020 World Report, China, under President Xi Jinping's leadership, has tightened its grip over sectors of society it found threatening, such as the internet, activists, and religious groups.
This is the most severe period of repression that we've seen in decades in China, probably going back to the Cultural Revolution or an era like that. Xinjiang is the worst, where 1 million or more Uyghur and Turkic Muslims are in detention for forced indoctrination, basically to pressure them to renounce Islam and their cultural traditions and even their language.
Kenneth Roth, executive director of the group, was barred Sunday from entering Hong Kong, where he planned to release this year's report. The Chinese government called it punishment for the group's support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong.
These groups tried by all means to instigate people to engage in extreme violent crimes, incite Hong Kong independence and separatist activities. These organizations are held responsible for the current unrest in Hong Kong and should be punished and pay their due prices.
Several countries have publicly criticized China for human rights violations, but stopped short of taking concrete measures against Beijing, including the West, where domestic issues like Brexit have diverted attention.
Traditionally, countries that have been strong on human rights have not said enough about the human rights situations in China. And other countries who are authoritarian, autocratic themselves, because, as I said, the economic ties with China, they have been mum about, the severe repression in Xinjiang and other human rights violations in China.
While the United States has imposed sanctions on some Chinese companies and officials tied to Chinese repression, rights advocates say U.S. President Donald Trump's embrace of President Xi Jinping and the U.S. policy of separating families at the U.S.-Mexico border have damaged U.S. credibility on human rights issues. Jesus Samelni, VOA News, Washington.
There are many artists who celebrate African history and culture. VOA's Thierry Kaore takes us to the studio of Louis Flanders, whose passion for the shape of Africa shapes his style.
In a small workshop in Norfolk, Virginia, Louis Flanders finds a design in the shape of Africa since leaving the U.S. military in 2016. Flanders has built a mixed media collection that outlines the continent in table and bookshelves, kitchen cutting boards, serving trays, and sculptures.
First, we pour the epoxy resin on it in like the silver clear color. And before it's dry, we put the glass stones on it just to give it a different effect, and it kind of makes it look, natural and earthy. I was known for building some smaller items out of wood, so a few people asked me to make some things in the shape of Africa, and then I got the idea to cater to a people who don't have something represented in a home from where they're from.
Flanders says his art has led to questions about where he's from and how African Americans share their pride in African culture.
Well, people first ask if, what my race is and why I'm doing this. And some people are friendly and some people are a little defensive, trying to see if I'm just trying to capitalize on someone else's culture, but it is of my culture. I am of mixed race.
Flanders' work combines individually mixed color and the latest computer-head machinery to execute his designs, including his signature bookshelf.
The Africa bookshelf design is my largest item, is what I'm most known for. It was to represent Africa in a different light that the world doesn't like to show it. It represents the history of Africa, the true education of Africa, and what came from that continent.
Flanders says selling his product online allows him to reach a wider audience and do enough business to make a living as an artist inspired by the African continent. Thierry Kaore for VOA News, Norfolk, Virginia.
We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, combining advocacy and empowerment to encourage women and girls to pursue careers in technology. We'll have a live report coming shortly. You're watching Africa 54, and we'll be back.
Is about more than just sitting here and talking about women's issues. It's about listening to them
and bringing their opinions to the table and making sure their voices are heard.
Because our lived experiences, our stories, and our voices will help shape the next generation.
I'm Clara Frank, and here's what's trending. They may look like just plastic bottles stuffed with paper, but to Matt Baker and his colleagues, these are building bricks that they're sorting at a warehouse in Cape Town, South Africa. Baker is the co-founder of the South African NGO ousted, which was founded in 2012 to help find solutions for the world's waste management problems. Eco-bricks are plastic bottles of varying sizes that are crammed with non-recycled material, making the bottles sturdy enough to be used in some forms of construction. They were first used in Guatemala about 30 years ago. Ousted say they now have over 20,000 eco-brick collection points in Cape Town. Next up, a century after the United States clamped down on alcohol and ushered in the Prohibition era, speakeasies are once again popping up behind hidden doors and luring in revelers seeking fancy cocktails with an illicit 1920s vibe. Just a few blocks from the White House, drinkers enter the mirror at the bottom of some steps that look at first glance like they lead to an empty store. The bar's two owners want to pay tribute to these great cocktail bars of the past. Known only to those with contacts on the inside, the illicit drinking holes were set up in basements or concealed rooms and got their name from their clients' need to speak softly to avoid betraying their presence to the police or suspicious neighbors. And that's what's trending today.
Here in the U.S., Democratic presidential contenders clashed over a number of issues in their debate Tuesday night, held less than 3 weeks before voters in Iowa head to the polls to kick off the 2020 primary season. VOA's Jim Malone has the evening's highlights.
A total of 6 Democratic contenders clashed over trade, health care, and foreign policy. And there was plenty of criticism of President Donald Trump and the recent tensions with Iran. Former Vice President Joe Biden.
We have lost our standing in the region. We have lost the support of our allies. The next president has to be able to pull those folks back together.
Biden took heat from Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders for Biden's support of the Iraq War. And Sanders said he worries the confrontation with Iran could get much worse.
And right now, what I fear very much is we have a president who is lying again and could drag us into a war that is even worse than the war in Iraq.
A similar concern from former South Bend, Indiana mayor and military veteran Pete Buttigieg.
We can continue to remain engaged without having an endless commitment of ground troops. But what's going on right now is the president's actually sending more.
Some of the candidates want to reduce U.S. troop presence in the Middle East, and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren says it's time to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan.
No one has a solution and an end point. We need to get our combat troops out. They are not helping create more safety for the United States or the region.
For billionaire and political newcomer Tom Steyer, it's time for a fresh approach on national security.
It isn't so much about experience, it's about judgment. If you've been listening to this, what we are hearing is 20 years of mistakes by the American government in the Middle East.
Democrats also jousted over which of them is best equipped to beat President Trump in the election. Warren sought to dispel the notion that a woman candidate would be at a disadvantage.
Can a woman beat Donald Trump? Look at the men on this stage. Collectively, they have lost 10 elections. The only people on this stage who have won every single election that they've been in are the women, Amy and me.
This was the final debate before Iowa voters head to the polls on February 3rd to begin the process of choosing a Democratic nominee to take on President Trump in November. Jim Malone, VOA News, Washington.
Now, for more insight on Tuesday's debate, I'm joined live from Iowa by Philip Crowther, an international reporter with the Associated Press Global Media Services. Hello, Philip.
Hello, good to be with you.
Did it get tense on the stage?
Yeah, it did at times, maybe not quite as much as we might have expected, and that's because of what came before and, of course, also what comes after the debate. After this debate, we go very close indeed to the Iowa caucuses. 19 days now to go before the first Americans get to vote and decide who their Democratic candidate might be to go up against Donald Trump in November. But what came before, more than anything, was an announced spat between Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. You heard part of the senator from Massachusetts' answer there to that specific debate. Now, what happened here was a CNN report came out 2 days ago that had details of a private meeting between the two senators, who are friends, by the way, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, during which Bernie Sanders told her that he believed that a woman could not win in 2020. She, of course, disagrees with that. Bernie Sanders says he never even said that, and that led to those responses on stage from Bernie Sanders saying that yes, he would support a woman to become president, and yes, he believes that a woman can become president. From Elizabeth Warren, part of that answer you already heard. She says emphatically that she can win in 2020.
So, Philip, who came out the winner and where do things go from here?
There wasn't a clear winner last night. Joe Biden, the former vice president, again, with a little bit of a difficult performance on stage. He's still failed to impress, really, over these 7 out of a total of 12 debates. He's still the favorite nationally to get that nomination for the Democratic Party. He's not necessarily the favorite to win here in Iowa on the 3rd of February during those caucuses. There are essentially 4 of those 6 candidates we saw on stage last night here at Drake University who have a chance of winning those caucuses. Former Vice President Joe Biden, of course, then the aforementioned Senators Warren and Sanders, but also Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend in Indiana. All of them could come away with a win here in just 19 days' time.
Philip, thank you. Philip Crowther is with the Associated Press Global Media Services. It's time for our technology report, and joining us now is our tech reporter, Paul Ndiho, with a special guest. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Esther. The U.S. Department of Labor estimates that this year there will be nearly 1.4 million jobs in computer science, but there is not enough qualified engineers to fill these positions. Not surprising, however, there are very few black women engineers in the country. However, Kayesu Machayo, who is pursuing a degree in computer science and international affairs at George Washington University, is here in Washington, wants to change that narrative. She says coding is not just for males, it's a language for the future. Kayesu, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you so much for having me.
What got you into this engineering field?
So my first exposure to computer science was the Girls Who Code summer immersion program. And there they teach you computer science fundamentals over a course of 7 weeks. And that's where I first learned anything about computer science. And it completely changed the trajectory of my career and my...
What has it been like?
It was incredible. I did it as a rising senior in high school. And it was an experience to really learn what it's like to be a computer scientist, what jobs are available, and how to really build and hone your skills to enter into the field.
Some of your friends regard you as a rising star in the coding field. So maybe talk to us more about coding. Why is it important for young girls or young women like you to get into coding?
Well, computer science is so important. Coding is fundamental to really being able to build products in this field. And it really is a wonderful foundation because you can use coding in the arts. You can be an audio engineer. You can do different things with so many different languages. And it's really a wonderful thing just to learn, regardless of what your passions are. You can merge it with computer science.
Who inspires you?
Oh, so many people inspire me. I would say primarily my mom. She came here as a refugee from Uganda, and she values education. It's an important thing to her, and she pursued her education. So I would say her, and as well the founder of Girls Who Code, Reshma Sajani. Her message is inspiring girls to be brave and not perfect, and really that's the important thing with computer science. Working on your bravery. It's not about perfection.
You told me earlier that during your gap year, you took a break and went somewhere in Africa to actually teach young girls how to code. Maybe share with us what that was like.
Yeah, I had the incredible experience and honor to go to Mbarara, Uganda, and I know I'm not rolling my R's properly, but that is a town in Uganda that is right next to where my mom actually grew up. And I was at the University of Science and Technology there working with Dr. Angela, and she gave me the opportunity to help with her Girls in STEM project. And so I was developing curriculum there and visiting secondary schools like St. Mary's Secondary School, and was able to connect with the girls and learn more about their journeys and hopefully inspire them as a first-generation American.
Speaking of young girls, there are so many young girls out there who are watching you. What kind of message would you give to young girls who want to be like you, who want to become engineers in the future?
Yeah, I would say really just be brave. It's not about perfection, like I said earlier, but also make sure that you're working on your grit. It's not always going to be easy, and I can say certainly for me, at the beginning, it wasn't easy at all, and it still isn't, but it's important that you have a community around you to support you and seeking mentors and role models in the field. And I would say my experience at Girls Who Code, having that sisterhood, having like-minded individuals who can support you is just very important in order to grow and in order to continue to be inspired.
I'm sure your mom and your other siblings are inspired as well. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Kayesu Machayo, attends George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. That's today's Tech Reporter. Back to you, Esther.
Paul, thank you. Be sure to join Paul Ndiho each Wednesday for the latest in technology. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, have a good evening.